Hey everyone, don't forget to join the Analysis in Chains Telegram group. Go to Telegram and search for Analysis in Chains.
This is the Analysis in Chains with Nathan Williams and Neil Kieran.
Analysis in Chains. I'm Nathan Williams. Joining me today is JP Thieriot. JP is the co-founder and head of strategy for Universal Protocol. JP, thank you for joining me today.
Thank you very much for having me.
Universal Protocol is a way for different blockchain protocols to transact together and to talk to each other, and a way for changing assets between different blockchains. Is that a good, accurate representation of what you guys are doing?
It is. I think the analogy that everybody could probably relate to is one that that draws a parallel between early internet and where blockchain or distributed ledger is today. And so the way we'd phrase it is, blockchain 2018 looks a lot like internet, call it 1989. So you have a wide swath of the global population that has probably gotten to a point that they realize that this is a meaningful new technology that is apt to change lots of businesses. But like the internet in '89, it's sort of siloed in these different things. In the context of the internet, it was AOL and Prodigy and CompuServe and so forth. And today, it's in the blockchain space. It's Ethereum and Bitcoin Cash and Monero and EOS and Zcash, and actually more and more of them every day. And so our notion was that in the context of the internet, it wasn't until TCP and IP merged and ultimately you had a namespace with DNS that you had the beginnings of the foundation of a common language that set the conditions for mass consumer uptake. And so in this case, what we're rolling out with UPP is a means of essentially leveraging the critical mass of smart contract logic, decentralized applications and exchanges that exist within Ethereum, and allowing any other blockchain or asset to be reasoned with by that preponderance of logic, by that critical mass that has been built inside of Ethereum.
It sounds like almost an impossible nut to crack. Like, if you're talking about different blockchains, they have completely different logics, completely different, maybe consensus mechanisms. How do you make them talk to each other without having some sort of centralized governor?
Well, there are, I should say, centralized components to the overall solution, and I think by necessity the path towards decentralization should be a gradual one. I think sort of theologically absolutist leaps into pure decentralization are apt to lose people a lot of money. Interesting though those leaps might be from a mathematical or technology perspective, they're complicated, they don't scale, etc. So in this case, really what we're doing is we're marrying this reserve management capability, this value substantiation capability that Uphold has perfected and battle tested across over 4 billion in transactions in 4 years, and marrying it to the edges of what Ethereum has accomplished. And so what that looks like is basically we can take a Bitcoin or a US dollar or a unit of Zcash or Dash or XRP, anything we like, and wrap it in an ERC20 token of our architecture, which introduces some features that address the second issue I'll talk about in a minute. But when we do that, when you have a universal Bitcoin, a Bitcoin that is wrapped in an ERC20 basically wrapper, it can be reasoned with by every decentralized exchange the next day. So people familiar with decentralized exchanges will know that most of them are Ethereum based, and most of them have obviously pointed to a future and made promises around being able to deal with non-native blockchains, but it hasn't really happened. And things like atomic swaps are complicated and well out of the reach of mom and pop to be able to use or do anything with. So what we're doing is we're taking the notion of holding an underlying Bitcoin in that context, representing it in a proxy or a universal ERC20 token, and now that token again can participate anywhere within the world of Ethereum.
Yeah. Now it feels like most of crypto is probably out of the reach of mom and pop today. But I'm curious as to this, because it's definitely true that everything we do with crypto results in a trade-off. And when we're talking about more decentral systems, you often trade off usability or security versus central systems where you're trading off trust. What sort of trade-offs are you expecting with being able to have this fungibility between different blockchains and this portability of different tokens?
That's a really great way of looking at it, and I think that the grand philosophical trade-off is between security and transactionality, right? So the most secure way to hold a cryptocurrency is offline, air-gapped, in a cement bunker, or as some people have discussed, in outer space, literally. So obviously, something that is that secure is rendered effectively non-transactional. And so the analogy that I think is useful in this case is that of the gold-backed dollar. So in the context of a gold-backed dollar, you had something sitting very securely in whatever it was, Fort Knox, and you have a representation of what's being held there in the context of a banknote in somebody's pocket. That banknote can be lost, burned up, stolen, etc. And actually, back in that context, the holder would not be able to go to Fort Knox and say, "Hey, you know what? I lost my $100 bill. Could I please have the underlying?" In this context, it's very similar. We're holding the underlying. Again, let's use Bitcoin in what is within our abilities to determine is the best or most hedged or most diverse location or among different providers. Something that I think we're in a better position to do than, again, mom or pop. And because custody is really not a part of the revenue model of UPP, it's our burden is to go out and stay at the fore of what is best practices, best providers, and custody happens to be an area that is evolving rapidly and is very interesting. And I think there's different criteria, right? Regulators are looking for stuff they're familiar with, so secure locations, that folks that have regulatory status as a trust or a bank, but that doesn't speak to the quality of the technology, right? And then there's another side of custody, companies like Anchor Labs and Ledger that are crypto native and are coming up with very clever solutions about how you merge these two things that would appear to be opposite forces, security and transactionality. So really what we're doing is we're trying to go with best of category, provider of security, and then on the transactionality side, by again putting all these things into where the preponderance of smart contract logic and other functions reside, you're making it highly transactional. And then the last little bit, which is to another great point you made, that mom and pop really don't have easy entry points into crypto. In the architecture of this wrapper we've created, we've done two things. Number one, we've created optionality. So if you are a technophile libertarian that really wants to hold on to his own private keys, our architecture allows you to to basically peel this stuff away from any exchange. We call it a detachable wallet. And if you want to go to an exchange to conduct a trading session, you can temporarily lend your credentials and balances, perform the trade you'd like to do, and then rip it out again and go store it in your hardware device or a bunker. But for mom and pop who presumably aren't on that end of the spectrum, what they want to know is if they lose this thing called a private key, which feels a lot like a password to my online banking, that I don't lose my money. If I die, I have an ability to, a priori program next of kin, Ethereum addresses and request that I be pinged every 2 years or 6 years or what have you for, a sign of life. And if that doesn't happen, my assets flow to the people I've identified as my next of kin. We've also constructed it so that it's easy to serve as collateral. It's easy to insure and be reinsured. So we're trying to not only address the issue of the lack of a common language, but also address the issue of the lack of conventional user safeguards associated with more mature asset classes.
Now, when you're talking about wrapping tokens in other tokens, or for example, universal tokens representing other assets, would you then be classified as a security token, or do you consider yourselves more of a utility?
Another great question. It really depends on the nature of the underlying. So, for instance, we're rolling out UPUSD, which is a dollar stablecoin, probably alongside UPEUR. And in both cases, we have memos from very well-known law firms suggesting that they are neither a security nor a derivative. And I guess another way to define how the sort of legal consensus seems to have shifted in the last 5 years, when the precursor to Uphold created the first dollar, pounds, euros, et cetera, sitting on crypto rails, the reason we didn't tokenize that and put it out in the world like a precursor to a tether was that the legal thinking back then was, there's people that have tried to do that. This guy in Hawaii issued, Joe's dollar, and, he ended up in the slammer. It seems that, governments don't like people usurping their seigniorage, right? The same law firms espousing that opinion 5 years ago will now tell you that a stablecoin is no different than prepaid open loop credit, than that prepaid $50 MasterCard sitting next to the checkout at a Home Depot. So, I don't know what else has changed other than the perception, but I think stable coins and basically fiat-based wrap tokens are very straightforward, not securities, not derivatives. When it comes to wrapping Bitcoin, in that case, you're talking about a virtual currency that nobody regards as a security either. I think you'd have the same nature of cover. If you were talking about wrapping something, where the underlying itself is at risk of being deemed a security, then I think you would step into those potential issues.
Now, with this, the controversy around Tether, I imagine it must have been important for you guys to undergo a fair bit of rigor in terms of scrutiny, just to make sure that you maintain trust, right? And how have you perceived the market to have shifted since you began, given sort of the hype and the craziness of earlier this year?
Yeah. So I think, what we're doing, so Uphold is pretty interesting in the sense that it apart from pioneering fiat units of account on crypto rails, it also has pioneered a concept of 24/7 granular transparency. So anybody
just 1 second. Sorry. Uphold. When you say Uphold, that's one of the founding members of Universal Protocol, correct?
Correct. Yeah. Along with Cred blockchain at Berkeley, Brave, and FBG.
Right. Okay, sorry. And uphold is an exchange of exchanges, as I understand it.
That's absolutely correct. And if one goes to uphold.com transparency, you'll see, the status of the reserve, all the historical value of transactions, number of transactions. And if you click into any particular unit of account, Bitcoin or dollars or euros or even gold bullion, you will see both the contingent liabilities, which is what are Uphold users holding, and then the assets, what is Uphold holding against those obligations. And so the notion is that they're not always perfectly matched. The objective is to be over 100% reserved, but it at minimum checks the box with what other folks refer to as one-to-one coverage, and it's related 24/7. Stuff that is on chain is easy to verify, and people can look up an address and see that something there in real time anyway. Stuff that isn't on chain, like dollars, pounds, euros, gold, requires a layer of attestation, and the best people to provide that, of course, would be big three accounting firms. So people who will have seen our early announcements know that we've been working with PwC on this. PwC is obviously a large and cautious firm, but they are interested and aware of crypto and its potential significance for many of the industries in which they deal. And so they've been very proactive about exploring with us how they might provide that layer of attestation and go beyond that into providing standards and best practices for how represented assets might be treated in the context of what UPP is trying to roll out.
Yeah, no, it definitely sounds like you guys have all your ducks in a row, and that brings us actually to an interesting sort of theoretical or I guess philosophical question, which is, as the industry matures and more regulatory oversight is in place, there's more due diligence done to ensure that we aren't in the Wild West anymore, that the assets are backed, that do you imagine that we are moving away from the original vision of blockchain, of are we trading away blockchain or Bitcoin's decentral soul? And do you think the future is going to be in a more corporate control of blockchain assets?
Really good question. And I guess the way I'd see it is you're getting a divergence between two things that have, sort of been intertwined with each other, but where I think the movement or the ecosystem has reached a phase where they need to diverge because one necessarily holds back the other. And the way I guess I'd describe these two intertwined parts of an ecosystem is, on the one hand, you have the sort of libertarian cypherpunk sort of view that all fiat currencies devalue over time. They're a scam. They've enjoyed a monopoly for centuries, and here there's the technical foundation for why that no longer needs to be the case. And so the way I would see that sort of spirit of the early ecosystem moving into the future is really inside of units of account that reflect those viewpoints. So if you have something called Zcash or Monero that tries to be maximally anonymous and doesn't respond, I'm not saying those two units of account necessarily are this, but you'll get these units of account, these platforms that go very, very hard in that direction, full on absolutist decentralization. All centralization is bad, etc.
Don't tread on me. My privacy is my own.
Exactly. And then you get the other side, which, I think is also really valuable because it itself is a massive improvement on the status quo, but it isn't necessarily, philosophically anti-establishment. It just picks up on practicalities like, hey, let's look at banking, right? Let's look at these heavily leveraged fractional reserves that objectively break down every 10 years or so and ultimately don't create Armageddon because the taxpayer is there at the end of the day to save things, right? That is not a good system, period. And you don't have to go all the way to the extreme of saying, all centralization, all government, all human beings are bad. Let the robots do it. It would be about, hey, how about transparency, for instance? How about full reserves? So it's not 11 or 14% tier one capital, massively leveraged, no incentive to innovate, terrible access issues. And basically, let's undo the fact that this industry was the last industry to be protected from being torn down to the studs and rebuilt in the internet's image. Let's have the internet do to this industry what it's done to everything else. And the only thing we'll be able to predict is all those efficiencies and improvements in access and lowering of cost and explosion in innovation will happen. And it doesn't need to be politically charged. It's just an improvement, full stop. And that side of the camp will be all about mass adoption, practicalities, producing good products, marketing them and servicing customers in the traditional way. And we'll be free of, spiels that mention, sovereignty and nation states and all that sort of verbiage that has been thus far intertwined.
And also free of the when Lambo, when Moon, maybe?
Yes. That'll happen anyway as the industry matures.
Great. Well, it sounds like you've got a lot going on. What can we expect from Universal Protocol in the coming months?
So we're going to roll out UPUSD and UPEUR in December, which ought to be interesting. These are stable coins that is to sort of prove our point aren't aimed at just being an auditable and better tether. They're actually aimed at the 2.5 billion holders of bank account and the billion beyond them in the world, all of whom are interested in cheaper credit and higher yield. And so hopefully it's in some way crypto delivering the goods of having a fraction of the, cost structure and baggage with respect to, outmoded, unupgradable technology, and being able to deliver that and being able to pay higher yield, charge lower credit because it doesn't have the same cost structure, and it's able to make use of some interesting facets of the properties of utility tokens to further mitigate, basically foregone operating revenue.
And if someone wanted to get involved with Universal Protocol, what's the best way for them to do that?
So most of the information is up on universalprotocol.io. There will be a public ICO that starts probably around mid-December. I think we're going to announce it at a conference at FBG's conference in San Francisco on December 11th. That's the plan for now. And then those proxy tokens will be available initially on Uphold, but eventually rolled out to other partner exchanges as we make those announcements here in the coming weeks.
That sounds exceptionally exciting, JP. Thank you very much for joining me today. JP Thieriot is the co-founder and head of strategy of Universal Protocol, and you can find out more at universalprotocol.io.
Thank you very much, Nathan. A pleasure speaking with you.